All right. Well, hey, here we are with the TEC21 podcast, and I am joined today with Reverend Trevor Sutton. Reverend Sutton is joining us from St. Luke's in Hazlet, Michigan. Did I get that right?
You got
Pastor
it
Sutton?
right. Yep.
Okay. So Pastor Sutton is both a great resource to the Michigan district and the LCMS as a whole. He's an author for CPH. Pastor Sutton, good morning. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. Looking forward to our conversation.
So Trevor, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, both as a pastor and as an author?
Yeah, I kind of like to tell people I have three sort of hats that I wear, and I love wearing each of those hats. The hat of pastor, the hat of writer, and academic. And those three kind of hats, along with husband and father and the other vocations. But for this conversation, those three hats, and I love wearing those because they all kind of play off each other. And so the work that I do in writing is often fueled by my pastoral ministry and care and life in the parish. But it's also then connected to my scholarly interests in technology and theology. And so they all feed off of each other, spark ideas for one another, and pursue me to explore new things, according to each of those different hats.
Oh, that's great. You've been doing some work on just keeping the conversation around technology, especially technology in the church, going. Your writing with CPH has kind of trended that way. I believe you're working on a doctorate is it Michigan State?
No, Concordia Seminary in St. Louis.
Oh, nice.
And I'm so close to being done. I have my dissertation forum in November, the dissertation signed and everything. And that dissertation was on technology in the church, especially online worship.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I think it's very, for those of you joining us, it's very timely then to have Pastor Sutton on to talk to us a little bit about the generative AI and how it's being perceived. This summer, Pastor Sutton wrote an article for Christianity Today where he talked about AI. And so, when we think about generative AI, we know that teachers and educators, principals, pastors, people in our churches, they have a lot of questions about this technology, what it is, how it's being used, et cetera. So, before we dive too deep into this topic this morning, Pastor Sutton, when we say generative AI, what does that mean?
Yeah, great question. I think to get a baseline understanding of what are we even talking about is always helpful to have a fruitful conversation. And in some ways, I think it's pretty aptly titled. If you pick it apart, you kind of get an understanding of what's going on here. That word generative is pretty key. Generating something, creating something. Generative AI creates original content. And how it does that is through artificial intelligence. So then you got to say, well, okay, what's artificial intelligence?
Right.
But the first thing is, whatever this new technology is, it is generating something, creating something. But basically, AI, we think of it as sci-fi and really futuristic. It is, but doesn't have to be necessarily. Really, AI is machines that are capable of doing a task that would otherwise require human intelligence. So AI is just, a machine that can do something that would be reflective of human intelligence. In that sense, AI has been around for a long time. Machine learning and computers that are able to sort data and provide intelligence in some way. We've had that for a long time. The new thing, and there's kind of a host of consumer apps that have really just recently come to market in the last 18 months or so. But what those do is it takes that machine learning, it takes that technology that can replicate human intelligence and create that original content. And so it's not just retrieving information and sorting information, but it's now taking that to compose things or write, if you will, an article or compose sounds and music and emulate that. And so it's what I like to tell people is there's this long line of AI that's been around since, I believe kind of the mid 50s.
Oh, wow.
So
okay.
It's been around for quite a long time, not in its present form, of course. But something new has happened now with this whole generative side of it, where it creates this content.
And that just opens so many doors. When we think about how much stuff we have to create in our vocations, in the church, in the school. I had mentioned just a minute ago that you had written an article for Christianity Today, and the article is titled "Pastors Lead Not Your Church into Fear of AI." And for those of you listening, watching, if you haven't had a chance, search that and go read the article. It's a fantastic read. In that article, you talked about some interesting ways that we could see the use of this generative AI, as you kind of just described it, at use in our churches and schools. What are some maybe examples of how you could see this tool being used in a way to benefit the church?
So in a lot of ways, we're probably already using this in a lot of our settings. And so churches may not always be fully aware of that. AI in general is, Google and Bing are a form of AI, and using AI, remote check capturing and things like that is a form of AI. But then already people are probably using this. Predictive text is a form of AI, and even closer to a generative AI, because it's generating something based on machine learning and recognizing what it thinks you're saying and says, would you like to finish it this way? And in a lot of ways, more robust forms of generative AI are just, they're chatbots, and they are predictive text, tools. So if you're composing an email and you use predictive text, you're already kind of using this in some way. Google Translate is in some way, it's an AI platform, but also generating something new, taking a text from English and translating it to Arabic or Swahili. And that's something our congregation, we have language speakers that are Arabic language speakers or Swahili. And so we'll take Bible studies and translate them with Google Translate. So we're using,
fantastic. Yeah.
Yep, we're using, generative AI in that sense. And then really, speech to text is also a form of generative AI, where you're generating content with this machine learning and artificial intelligence. So those are kind of ways that are already present.
Yeah.
But then soon, and very soon, maybe already, but Google's introducing generative AI into their suite of products. So Google Docs and Gmail, which I know a lot of educators and schools and churches certainly use that. And so that will be moved into that suite of products and will be right there, unless, of course, a school finds a way to, turn that off or prohibit that or something like that. It'll be right there. And what that'll look like is, as you start using Google Docs and it looks like you're preparing a book report or a literature review, it will recognize that and say, can I help you? And, type this prompt in and provide me a lit review of, this particular topic with sources from this and that sort of thing. And it'll spit it out based on that. And so, in that sense, it will intrude itself in our existing platforms we're using, that kind of thing. Other examples, would be a church or a school creating a logo or something like that, creating voiceover for video. So you could, provide text, and then it will generate a very human sounding voice for a video, that sort of thing. And then, of course, there's always the possibility of, someone using it to create a school newsletter or a church newsletter, and based on certain parameters and so forth, prompts. So there's things that are already at our fingertips today, and certainly things that with a little searching or a little work, you could find and use.
Yeah, I was looking at some statistics of, how, especially teachers, how is their time divided up? And there was a study done within the last couple of years where it says, teachers spend 54% of their time doing administrative tasks. And so just recently, I took a picture of a schedule, and I like a planning doc for doing a school schedule, and I just threw it into ChatGPT, and I said, hey, build us a schedule for a middle school based on these parameters. And it was able to interpret my image, pick out the patterns, and work with a list of priorities and build a schedule in about 7 minutes.
Yeah.
And so, you have to work with it a little bit, but I do see the benefits of it. And I could see how a church newsletter could take maybe an administrative assistant in a church office a lot of time to put together, or even just working up a graphic for a sermon series. Seems like that could be something that could be helpful to use, what they call DALL-E.
Yeah, and this is maybe taking us in a slightly different direction, but your example there, like no educator is going to then push print on that schedule without vetting it and seeing, right, does this actually work for our specifics and so forth? And you might make some edits and changes before you send it out. And I think that's maybe a misnomer we have with some of this, is that if it gets things wrong, which it will, but if it gets things wrong, that we are just beholden to use it, problems and all. And it's sort of like, no, we're not extricating the human side of it. When in fact, it's a tool that we use, but we don't fully remove ourselves from the equation in it. I think that's sometimes, as I hear people talk about it, they talk about the flaws and failures and mistakes it will make, which again is correct, but we still play air traffic controller and human and curator of this data before it's ultimately shared with our organizations, our churches, our schools, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's doing the heavy lifting through kind of all of the iterations, so we can it can get us to a closer to a final product, to a final rough draft, so to speak.
Correct.
Before, yeah, and I think that's the way I see myself using it, and I've seen others start to put content maybe out on Twitter or different places about how they're using it. With all the positives, just with the way it can save us time or generate images, text, etc. We also deal in a lot of sensitive information, and a lot of information that people share with us that's very personal. What kind of cautionary tips might you offer to those watching in the way of using this cautiously, the kind of information you might feed ChatGPT or other generative AI?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to suggest kind of in big, huge, broad level terms or low level kind of boots on the ground terms. Maybe the big broad ones would just be this, that it is important to understand how this generates the material that it generates. And really what it's doing is it's scraping the content of the internet to generate this stuff. So huge data sets, those data sets being more or less the internet, which is a tremendous data set. But there is that sense in which what you're saying is sensitive information that goes on the internet, or incorrect information that goes on the internet, is then subject to being regurgitated through generative AI. And so that's kind of a big thing. And that's where you hear some of this concerns about generative AI hallucinating or just making up information. And in fact, that is a reality. But I would kind of argue that's a reality that we've had to teach our children too. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. So again, there's a rupture in this, and it is different, but there's a continuity between all of it. More practically speaking, kind of boots on the ground, I would really advocate for schools and churches, developing concrete policies and procedures that address AI tools. Certainly, those policies will be iterative, and they will change, year to year, and even maybe quarter to quarter kind of thing. But I guess the key thing would be this: is you'd rather not test a circumstance kind of after the fact of, is this plagiarism or is it not? It might be better to say predictively, going out ahead of it, like this is what counts as, copyright matters or plagiarism or content creation. And this is inbounds, this is out of bounds. Even if you have to continue to hone that policy, so for instance, for a church, I think it'd be wise for a pastor or elders or a council or governing board to talk about, what would be considered, plagiarism or something like that. If a church secretary created a newsletter with ChatGPT and people found out after the fact, would they be okay with that or not? And it's probably better to have that conversation before you do it than after you do it. Or in a sermon illustration, not a whole sermon, but what if a pastor uses ChatGPT for a paragraph of a sermon illustration? Or help me find Bible verses that have to do with this topic of A, B, C, and D. And then if the elders find out about that, is that okay or not? And I'm not advocating for or against any of that. What I am saying is it'd be wise to create a policy around that before you try it.
Yeah. I think on the school side, for sure, like, that makes total sense. If you as a teacher went to your principal and said, hey, I have a teacher that's using, or I would like to use ChatGPT to write a newsletter, would parents be okay if they knew that that content wasn't you? Like, or, would the school board be okay with the principal using it to work up a part of the annual report, or just those kinds of things? I think you're right. You're probably better off having these conversations before we're just jumping in and using it. I think one of the things you mentioned, either in a podcast I watched or in an article, and I think you alluded to it just now, and that is, you should not be afraid to say you've used ChatGPT. And if you are, or if you're concerned that just saying that will make people uncomfortable or they will create problems, probably need to have a conversation about it.
Yep, exactly. That's where I think, I'm an advocate for critically assessing these things and having a discourse about it on the front end rather than the back end.
Yeah.
And instead of just kind of schlepping into this and then 3 years later saying, yeah, let's begin to reflect on this. Again, it's going to be more iterative, and you're going to have to continue to move the boundaries and the parameters. But I think that's wise as we integrate this in to have discourse and conversation, what we're doing right now and what people are listening to. That's part of that whole thing, as opposed to finding those fault lines and then having a big kerfuffle as a result of it.
We would not like any kerfuffles, that's for sure.
That's a technical term, but yes.
And speaking of just how to approach this, right? Like you said, having discourse about it. One of the things that I thought you had mentioned recently was there are two things that we absolutely should not do with generative AI. Would you like to expound upon that?
Yeah, those two things are basically jump right in or totally avoid it like the plague.
Mm-hmm.
And those are just kind of two extremes. And here's my point would be this, jump right in because it's neat and shiny and new, jump in the deep end and just without any critical reflection, without any theological reflection, without any communal conversation, just use it. See what happens. Like that should be avoided. But then the other extreme of, because it's scary, because it's new, completely avoid it and leave our students in the dark on it, or leave our school in the dark on it, or for administrators and principals and pastors to avoid it and then find it creates problems because we haven't addressed it and talked about it, and just so somewhere between those things. And that's where I'm a big advocate for what I call, learning how to critically assess technology. Mm-hmm. And that's not critical in the negative sense, but it's the ability to understand it, reflect on it, see the benefits, see the challenges or the problems created by it, almost developing, in the terms of education, kind of a technological literacy.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a big advocate for people realizing that all technology makes some things easier and some things harder. And it's not all positive and all negative, but it's a mix of those two things. And we need to be able to assess that and do that with wisdom.
Yeah, and in doing that ministry to ministry, or when you're working within the context of your parish, like in your particular situation, in your school, you got to think about your constituents. I think in some environments, in some schools, like in TEC21, for instance, we have schools all over the world. And so, when we think about Lutheran schools, we have to just think about the environment and our constituents. And I'm sure the same is true of the parish. Some churches are going to be ready to start using this and baby stepping into it. And some are going to want to have more conversation and take their time and watch how it develops and unfolds. But I think you're right. We have to have that conversation. We have to start talking about it because it's here. It's present in our society. It's only going to get more powerful. As ChatGPT, the wake that it created last November, I remember reading news articles about Google pulling developers off other projects and just dumping them onto their AI team, just because now there's kind of the generative AI race, so to speak. who can do it best and who can make it the most useful to the consumer. We're at time. And so I just want to be, mindful of that. And I just wanted to say thank you for all that you've shared this morning. As we exit, there's one final question, and that is, there's been a lot of concern amongst our teachers about cheating. And it's one that comes up a time and time again. And, just this term, this idea of ethics and faith, and, how do we ground students so that they're using this in an ethical way? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that. Kind of two parts in that. The first one would be, I think the issue of ethics and cheating and so forth. I think this will change assessment for teachers. And what that goes back to Marshall McLuhan, and he has 4 laws of media. One of those laws of media is that new media retrieves something from the past. And in this case, I would think it's going to sound kind of crazy, but the prevalence of ChatGPT and the possibility of students wholesale plagiarizing, lit reviews and essays and so forth, it will retrieve something really old school, the oral report or Socratic questioning. And this time of, okay, student, you've submitted this paper. Now we're going to spend 5 minutes, you and me, talking about it. And if you can't cogently talk about it, this raises some questions. Or if I can't ask you a series of kind of Socratic questions and it unravels after this first or second question, that demonstrates maybe you've used this incorrectly. And so I think there is a retrieval where older forms of assessment may actually have a new exigency and urgency for teachers, which is a bigger conversation for another day, I guess.
And fascinating to think about. I mean, really good.
But then taking that deep breath, I guess my thought would be this to kind of close us out. Our ultimate hope is not in technology. Psalm 71, for you, O Lord, are my hope, my trust. And so just the idea that this is not our ultimate hope, but it's also, to put it a different way, this is not our ultimate fear. Technology is not our ultimate fear. Luther talks about in the first commandment, fear, love, and trust above all else. That's an idol. And so if we're overly fearful of this thing, that too could be a problem. And, Psalm 1, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so this kind of deep breath of our hope is not in this technology. Our ultimate fear is not in this technology. And between those two extremes, we fear, love, and trust in God above all else.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Reverend Sutton, for being with me today and sharing these just your insights into generative AI and with your experience and all of that. We really appreciate your time. For all of you watching, to stay tuned for additional episodes coming from the TEC21 podcast. And we thank you. Blessings on your day.